All right, everyone, get ready for a deep dive today. We're going deep into the disturbing story of William Dean Christensen. You might know him as well, the American Jack the Ripper. I bet a lot of you are familiar with the original Jack the Ripper case. But an American counterpart. Now, that's a story we need to unpack. And we're going all in on this one. We've got court records, we've got newspaper clippings, even some biographical info to really paint a full picture. But we're not just here to lay out the facts of his crimes. I mean, those are definitely disturbing enough, believe me. But we really want to understand the why behind it all. The psychology, the how, the failures of the justice system. What does this case tell us about serial killers? The big questions.
Yeah, exactly. It's like piecing together a puzzle. A really dark and disturbing puzzle, but a puzzle nonetheless. We need to understand what made Christensen tick. Were there red flags that everyone missed? Could any of this have been prevented? And how does this case fit into the bigger picture of serial killers?
So Christensen starts out seemingly normal, right? Born in Bethesda, Maryland, 1945. Nothing too out of the ordinary, at least on the surface. But then 1969, everything changes.
Oh yeah, 1969 is a turning point for sure. This is when we see that first brutal attack. He picks up a hitchhiker in Georgetown, rapes her, and then stabs her 19 times. 19. It's just unbelievable, the level of brutality right off the bat.
And the fact that she survived is a miracle in itself. But after all that, Christensen only gets 5 years. And get this, he doesn't even serve those in a typical prison. He goes to a facility for juvenile delinquents and then gets out after just 1 year. 1 year. I mean, what do you make of that?
It's baffling, right? That kind of leniency for such a violent crime. Did the system completely fail to see the danger here? Did they underestimate the potential for things to escalate?
Because escalate they did. 1974 rolls around, and Christensen, along with an accomplice this time, they abduct a go-go dancer and repeatedly rape her. But here's where it gets really chilling. He tells her, "I will dismember you with a hacksaw."
It's like something out of a horror movie. And it's more than just an empty threat. It speaks to something deeper, something darker. A fascination with violence, a need for control, maybe even premeditation of the horrors to come.
I mean, talk about foreshadowing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sadly, this wasn't just an isolated incident either. He gets 16 years for this. 16 seems like a decent sentence, finally catching a break. But again, he gets out early, 1980. It really makes you wonder, how many lives could have been saved if he'd served his full sentences?
Absolutely. It's impossible to know for sure, but you have to wonder about the ripple effects of those early releases. The victims whose lives were tragically cut short because the system didn't do its job.
And it doesn't end there.
Mm-hmm.
Just a few months later, July 1980, another abduction, another rape, this time in D.C. The authorities were on his trail, but he managed to slip away. Then, January 81, Christensen tries to make a run for it. He tries to flee to Toronto, but gets caught.
This attempted escape is interesting, right? Because they don't arrest him for the rapes. He gets busted for passport falsification.
Passport falsification.
Yeah, he only ends up serving 21 days, a slap on the wrist. And during that time, he assumes a new alias, Richard Owen, a fresh start, so to speak. A new identity to hide his past crimes.
And with this new name, he manages to move around undetected, at least for a little while. But then, April 1981, it happens again. He kidnaps and rapes a woman in Montreal, and this time he gets a 1.5-year sentence. But wait, there's a twist, right?
Oh, a big one. See, the Canadian authorities, they knew about his past. They tried to transfer him back to Maryland to face those charges. But get this, there's a clerical error. And because of that error, Christensen gets released.
The clerical error. You're kidding.
I wish I was. One tiny mistake, and this dangerous predator is back on the streets.
Talk about a missed opportunity. And unfortunately, this mistake would have devastating consequences. Because in 1982, Christensen is on the run. And the violence, well, it escalates to a whole new level. He murders Sylvie Trudel and Muriel Guay in Montreal that April.
And this is where things take a really dark turn. We're not just talking about rape anymore. He beats them, strangles them, decapitates them, and dismembers them. It's a level of brutality that's almost unimaginable.
It's hard to even fathom what would drive someone to that.
What was going on in his mind? Was it about control? Was it about dehumanizing his victims? Or was it something even more sinister?
Thankfully, this time the police were on his trail quickly. They found one of the victims in an apartment he'd been using, and there were witnesses who could place him at the scene.
So they knew who they were looking for, but they were always one step behind.
He fled to the U.S. before they could arrest him, and even with warrants out for his arrest, he managed to stay ahead of them.
This guy was like a phantom, popping up in different places, always just out of reach.
And here's where it gets even more complicated. His parents, they actually met with him during this time. and they admitted to giving him $5,000.
That's a tough one, right? Family loyalty versus the safety of others. Were they trying to help him turn himself in, or were they unwittingly enabling him to continue his spree?
It's impossible to know for sure what their intentions were, but it's a question that hangs heavy over this case. So Christensen's on the run, he's got money, and he's still a danger to everyone around him. He moves from state to state, always one step ahead of the law.
A true fugitive.
Eventually, he ends up settling between Trenton and Philadelphia, and he adopts a new alias, John Robert Schrader.
Another new name, another attempt to blend in, to erase his past and start fresh.
But the past has a way of catching up, doesn't it? And on September 23, 1982, Christensen strikes again. He murders Michelle Angiers in Scranton, Pennsylvania. He picks her up, drives her to a secluded area, rapes her, and then stabs her 30 times.
30 times. The brutality just keeps escalating,
Yeah.
and he's getting more and more brazen, more mobile, more difficult to track.
He's like a chameleon, adapting to his surroundings, changing his methods, changing his identity. He even shot 2 men at an Amtrak station in June of '83. Thankfully, they survived, but it shows how unpredictable he was. And then, yet another name change, Jeffrey Schrader. Why all the aliases? Was it just about evasion, or was there something more psychological going on?
It's hard to say for sure, but it's possible that each new identity represented a fresh start for him, a way to distance himself from his past crimes, almost like he was trying to outrun his own demons.
Trying to outrun himself.
Yeah.
And it's under this Jeffrey Schrader persona that he commits his final known murder.
December of '83, he kills Joseph Connolly outside a bar in Philadelphia. This time, though, there are witnesses. And those witnesses are what finally bring Christensen's reign of terror to an end.
But even then, the story takes another unbelievable turn. He's convicted for Connolly's murder, but under the alias Jeffrey Schrader. And somehow the system fails again.
You see, the FBI's fingerprint database, it didn't flag him. They had his prints on file, but they didn't connect them to Schrader. It wasn't until after the conviction that they realized who they had.
I mean, how is that even possible?
It's a staggering thought, isn't it? All those years, all those crimes. And he was right under their noses the whole time.
It makes you question everything. And it was around this time that the nickname, the American Jack the Ripper, really took hold. It was coined by Pennsylvania Constable Bill McAndrew. And the media, well, they ran with it.
The parallels are there, for sure. The brutal murders, the mutilation, the mystery surrounding his identity. It captivated the public imagination.
Just like the original Jack the Ripper. But unlike Jack, Christensen's story has an ending. A tragic ending, but an ending nonetheless. And with his capture, the investigation could really begin.
They had a lot of ground to cover, a lot of unanswered questions to try and piece together.
And in 1985, they finally linked Michelle Angier's murder to Christensen. They found a bloody knife and a hacksaw in his home, tools that fit his MO perfectly.
The evidence was mounting. And finally, justice was starting to catch up with him.
He was convicted in 1990 and sentenced to 10 to 20 years for Angier's murder.
Yeah.
And then he faced charges for that 1981 rape in Maryland. He got another 40 years on top of his existing sentence.
Some semblance of justice, but it doesn't bring back the victims.
No, it doesn't. And while he was in prison, Christensen made a shocking claim. He allegedly confessed to 24 murders.
24 murders.
You heard that right.
Across how many locations?
Across the U.S., Canada, even England.
It's a mind-boggling number, and it begs the question, how many of those confessions were true?
Were there dozens of unsolved cases out there connected to him? We may never know the full extent of his crimes.
It's a chilling thought, a reminder that sometimes the truth dies with the perpetrator.
Sadly, in Christensen's case, that's exactly what happened. He died of natural causes in prison in 1990.
No dramatic showdown, no final confession, just a quiet end to a life filled with so much darkness and violence.
Leaving behind a legacy of pain and a mountain of unanswered questions.
It's unsettling, to say the least, to think that someone could inflict so much suffering and then just slip away, leaving us to grapple with the aftermath.
It's a case that stays with you. A case that forces us to confront the darkest parts of human nature.
And a case that reminds us that there's still so much we don't understand about the origins of violence, about the failings of our systems, about the monsters that walk among us, hidden in plain sight. It really makes you think, doesn't it? About those unanswered questions, about the things we'll never know for sure.
It definitely does. And I think it's important to acknowledge that there's so much we can't know for sure about Christensen. But we can try to piece together what we do have, right? I mean, we know he had this seemingly normal upbringing in Bethesda, but then, boom, this sudden explosion of violence.
Yeah, it's almost like a switch flipped, right? And we're left wondering, what was the catalyst? What was the trigger?
Was he always predisposed to this kind of darkness? Or was it something that happened to him? Nature versus nurture?
Right, that age-old question. And it's impossible to say for certain in Christensen's case, but it's worth exploring those possibilities, don't you think?
Absolutely, because it's not just about understanding Christensen himself. It's about understanding the bigger picture, the patterns, maybe even recognizing warning signs in others before it's too late.
Exactly. And who knows, maybe by studying cases like this, we can develop better intervention strategies, better ways to prevent these tragedies from happening in the first place.
Speaking of prevention, one thing that really stands out in Christensen's case is, well, the missed opportunities, those early releases, that clerical error in Canada. It's almost like this system was setting him up to fail.
And to hurt others. It's a tough pill to swallow. To think about how many lives could have been saved if the system had just worked as intended.
It's heartbreaking. And it's important to remember that those weren't just statistics. Those were real people.
With families, with dreams, with futures ahead of them. And it's their stories that should be at the forefront of this conversation.
Absolutely. And it's a reminder that every decision, every action has consequences. And those consequences can ripple outward, impacting countless lives. So, okay, let's shift gears a little bit. We've talked about the failings of the system, but what about the investigation itself? What were the key factors that finally led to Christensen's capture?
Well, I think it was a combination of things, right? The witnesses in the Connolly murder were crucial, obviously. Without them, he might still be out there. But it was also the persistence of the investigators, the tireless work they put in to connect the dots. They unearthed the physical evidence, they followed the trail, and eventually they caught up with him.
It's a reminder that even the most cunning criminals can't outrun justice forever.
Exactly, and that's a hopeful message. Because for a while there, it seemed like Christensen was unstoppable.
He really was like a phantom, blending into the shadows.
And that's what makes serial killers so terrifying, isn't it? That ability to appear normal, to blend in, while harboring such darkness beneath the surface.
It's a chilling thought. And it brings us back to the question of prevention. What can we do to stop these tragedies from happening again?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And I don't think there's a simple answer, but I do think it starts with awareness, with education. We need to be aware of the warning signs. We need to be willing to intervene when necessary.
And we need to create a society that's more supportive, more compassionate, a society that addresses the root causes of violence rather than just reacting to it.
That's a tall order, I know, but I believe it's possible if we're willing to work together.
And we need to be careful about how we talk about these cases, right?
Yeah.
The media can play a powerful role in shaping public perception.
Absolutely. I mean, think about the nickname, the American Jack the Ripper. It's catchy, it's memorable, but does it glorify the violence? Does it feed into a morbid fascination that could even inspire copycats?
It's a valid concern, for sure. We need to find a way to report on these cases responsibly without sensationalizing them.
Right, because ultimately, we don't want to give these individuals the notoriety they crave. The focus should be on the victims, on their stories, on preventing future tragedies.
Which brings us back to the question of legacy. What will William Dean Christensen's legacy be? Will he be remembered as a monster, as a boogeyman, or can we extract something meaningful from his story?
It's a tough question, but I believe it's possible to learn from even the darkest chapters of human history, and maybe, just maybe, by studying Christensen's case, by understanding his motivations, we can prevent future tragedies from unfolding.
It's a glimmer of hope in an otherwise very dark story.
A glimmer of hope that's worth holding on to.
It's crazy, you know? This case happened decades ago,
Mm-hmm.
but it still feels so relevant today. Violence, justice, the nature of evil. These are issues we're still struggling with, aren't we?
Absolutely. And unfortunately, Christensen's story, it's not unique. It reflects a pattern we see in so many serial killer cases. The troubled past, the escalation of violence, the missed chances to intervene. It's tragic, but it's a story that's all too familiar.
It makes you think about the bigger picture, right? Like, what kind of world are we living in that allows these things to happen? What are the societal factors at play here?
Well, that's a complex question, but I think we need to look at things like poverty, inequality, limited access to mental health care, exposure to violence at a young age. These are all factors that can contribute to criminal behavior, sadly.
It's like a cycle, right? A cycle of violence and despair that we need to break.
Exactly. We can't just focus on punishment. We need to address the root causes, the systemic issues.
We've talked about the justice system, the media, but what about us as individuals? What can we do?
That's a great question. I think it starts with awareness, with education. We need to be aware of the warning signs. and be willing to speak up, to intervene when necessary.
And to have those tough conversations about mental health, about violence, about the things that make us uncomfortable.
Right, because sometimes discomfort is a sign that something needs to change.
And that change, it starts with each and every one of us. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the chilling story of William Dean Christensen, I want to leave you with this. Don't let this be just another true crime story you listen to and forget. Let it be a call to action, to be more aware, more compassionate, more engaged in creating a safer world.
Well said, I couldn't agree more. Let's honor the victims by working to prevent future tragedies.
Thank you for joining us on this journey. Stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe out there.